to everybody that has joined us for our live conversation with three very special individuals who will be performing as part of our Bach Festival and St. Matthew Passion coming up on April 1st and 2nd. I'm delighted to have Martin Haselbock, Jeremy Joseph, and Aaron Sheehan join us today. And before we begin our conversation, I just want to extend my appreciation and thanks to Dana White for his assistance with today's presentation. So I'm going to start with introductions of our three special guests today, and then I'll provide a very brief overview of St. Matthew Passion, and then we'll ask a couple of questions of each of our panelists, and then we'll have questions for everybody, so we can have sort of a free-form conversation.
Perfect.
So I'm going to start off by introducing Martin. As an organist or a conductor, Martin Haselbock is firmly established in the international music scene. His intensive involvement with the repertoire of classical church music as part of his work as a court organist was the beginning of his conducting career and prompted him to find the Orchestra Wiener Academy in 1985. Since 2004, he has also been music director of the Musica Angelica Baroque Orchestra. As an opera conductor, he has directed new productions at major festivals and opera houses in Europe, North America, and South America. Martin has been committed to the music of Franz Liszt for many years. He is also the director of the Liszt Academy. Martin has received numerous awards, such as the Austrian Cross of Honor for Science and the Arts. As a professor formerly at the Lübeck University of Music and now at the University of Music and Performing Arts, Vienna, he is a mentor to many young generation of organists. So welcome, Martin. We're delighted to have you. And we're delighted to have your fantastic library with us also.
Good.
And next up, we have Jeremy Joseph. Jeremy is organist of the Vienna Court Chapel, where he performs the weekly Sunday Mass together with the Vienna Boys Choir and the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra. Winner of the Gottfried Silbermann International Organ Competition in 1999, Jeremy has performed as a soloist at festivals and venues throughout Europe, as well as in Hong Kong, Seoul, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. Jeremy's improvisation CD recorded at the Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City was listed as CD of the Year in 2018 by Phono Forum magazine. As a continuo player, he has performed with ensembles such as the Wiener Academy Orchestra, Freiburger Baroque Orchestra, Kammerorchester Basel, and Balthasar Neumann Ensemble. In 2019, he was appointed professor for organ and improvisation at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Nice to meet you. Nice to have you here. American tenor Aaron Sheehan is recognized internationally as a leading interpreter of Baroque repertoire and equally at home on the concert platform and the opera stage. He has performed leading roles in operas by Cavalli, Handel, Vaughan Williams, Weill, and Satie. Aaron's voice has been described by the Boston Globe as superb. His tone, classy, clear, and refined, encompassing fluid lyricism and ringing force, and the Washington Post praised his polished, lovely tone. Engagements have taken him to many major venues, including the Tanglewood Festival, Lincoln Center, and Concertgebouw. He has performed concerts with Seattle Symphony, American Bach Soloist, Handel and Haydn Society, Boston Early Music Festival, Tafel Music, New York Collegium, Charlotte Symphony, and Musica Angelica. A native of Minnesota, Aaron holds a BA from Luther College and an MM in early voice performance from Indiana University. Go Hoosiers. All right. Delighted to have you all here today. So I'm going to dive right in. You all know quite a bit about the Passion, but for our audience that's watching today, just to set the tone, a brief description of St. Matthew Passion. I didn't author this because I decided I'd just pull it straight out of the internet. That way we know we're getting the real deal here. So the St. Matthew Passion is a sacred oratorio written by Johann Sebastian Bach in 727 for solo voices, double choir, and a double orchestra, with libretto by Picander. It sets the 26th and 27th chapters of the Gospel of Matthew in the Luther Bible to music with interspersed chorales and arias. It is widely regarded as one of the greatest masterpieces of Baroque sacred music. The original Latin title translates to The Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ, according to the evangelist Matthew. So I think that's a great place to begin. And I'm going to start with a question for Martin, because I think you've even expressed this, Martin, on several occasions, that this is an outstanding piece of music. St. Matthew Passion is widely regarded as one of the greatest masterpieces of Baroque sacred music. In your opinion, what makes this oratorio so exceptional?
Yeah, first, the sheer size of it. It's as long as a long opera, which you do in a theater. It's for church music, one of the biggest and most massive, most elaborate pieces of music. And then the idea which is behind. For Bach, music of any kind is a way to preach, to tell us a story. And for sure that the gospel is the central story of this St. Matthew Passion, but his commentaries, which he brings into the music, makes it outstanding. In some ways, he can speak to us through the music. And as Mozart put it in a later time, this piece is written for music lovers and for connoisseurs. The music lover gets some great music in stereotype, 2 choirs, 2 orchestras, 8 soloists, and so on. And the connoisseur, the more you listen to this piece, the more you get into it, you always discover new messages, new ideas, new beauties, which cannot be discovered at the first hearing, at the first time. But this is a piece where the composer tells us something in addition to the text, which is used to express this music. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So I want to continue on that kind of theme, and I love that what you're describing is how the interpretation of the piece of music, can change and evolve as you actually perform it, which is kind of a good lead into the next question. Because as the artistic director and conductor of this performance, how do you achieve the right balance of piety, spirituality, sorrow, and beauty in presenting this piece? Because it seems to me a lot of critics feel that it can be too pious or too much an exercise in musical style rather than emotional drama. So how do you create that balance?
Yeah, when this piece was rediscovered, we have to imagine it was forgotten, and it's just by surprise it survived, because it was totally out of fashion. We even don't know how often Bach actually really played it. And then it was forgotten, and the composer Mendelssohn rediscovered it and re-performed it in the 19th century. And at this time, all the performance tradition was lost. People didn't know anymore. Was this a huge choir which performed it? Was it a symphony orchestra? Was it a chamber orchestra? And so there were many traditions which went into a way which was not the original idea of the composer. And so what we do right now, we go back to the roots. And this is the first message. We use the instruments which Bach has used. We used exactly the distribution of singers. So it's not a symphonic choir which does this piece. It's a small ensemble of soloists who do it. And so you get the message at first, okay, we are back to the original performing idea. This is very important already, because this gives us this right sound and this right idea how it should be played. And then in some ways, this piece has a long tradition with Musica Angelica. When I started here, we did a huge tour, which was kind of a European tour, European and American tour, to bring this piece together with my Vienna orchestra, together with my with Musica Angelica, to places in Mexico, in North America, in 5 different European countries. And this is what we kind of continue with our annual performance, which is so graciously supported by Colburn, by the Colburn Foundation. And if everything goes well, we will have a repeat international performing trip next season in 24, where we do the piece again in the Golden Hall in the Vienna Musikverein, which is our home in Vienna. and in the Salzburg Mozarteum, and again at the First Congregational Church, which is one of the great venues in America to do this piece. So I think this combination, right size of orchestra, all specialists, fantastic singers, because to sing these soloists, solo parts, you have to be outstanding, and then the right venue. I think First Congregational has this dignity, this beautiful acoustic, which creates really this atmosphere. You don't have to add much. You just do it right, and then you get the message, and people get the feeling, the right feeling for the performance.
Well, it is definitely a fantastic stage on which to present this masterpiece, First Congregational Church here in Los Angeles. So speaking of stages, St. Matthew Passion seems to have its roots in the theater. And a question I have for Jeremy is related to this. It was written in two parts or two acts, and essentially it is a theatrical concept, a drama that when first performed was considered too operatic, too unorthodox. The role of the listener in St. Matthew Passion is often lost in the complexities and majesty of Bach's composition. So a question I have for you, Jeremy, is what can our audiences, or our listeners in this case, of today expect to experience in attending our performance?
Yeah, well, I think Bach is always dramatic. And as Martin said, he's a great storyteller. So they will completely be involved from the very beginning to the end of this piece in this drama, which he so well captures as a storyteller. And the musicians will know in his stories there are also hidden riddles and theological symbolism, numerical symbolism, and so forth. And in terms of operatic or being perceived as being operatic, there were a lot of overlaps in Bach's time. If you think of the Christmas oratorio, for example, the opening chorus was from a secular cantata, and then was later rewritten as a sacred piece. So you do have these overlapping forms as in terms of operatic and sacred. I think even if people follow with the text or they don't follow the text, the drama of the piece is really there to follow and to feel. The addition of having this double choir really adds to the dramatic sensation which this piece gives, and the way Martin has formed the choir in the original dimensions, where you have the soloists who basically sing the parts of disciples and so on, that they are also in the choir, and they are also part of the angry mob, the bloodthirsty mob. It becomes something extremely intense, and we can listen to, I think, some of the most intense music of Bach. There are some recitativos, recitativi, for example, which Jesus sings, where he sings of his soul being anguished. Meine Seele ist betrübt bis in den Tod, where it's extremely intense. And I think it will take the listeners really on a journey yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, no doubt many are very familiar with this story, obviously, which obviously helps the audience's kind of response. But as a renowned organist, how does the interplay between the text and the music you will perform amplify the dramatic arc of St. Matthew Passion?
Yeah, well, as Bach really knows how to bring a text to life. If you take the Erbarme dich aria and the somber violin writing, it's very clear in which direction you accompany. As an organist, of course, we are very dependent on how, for example, the evangelist interprets his parts. We have our short chords to play, and if an evangelist is dramatic, then the more dramatic we play. If the evangelist is clear and really sings the text for the audience to understand, it's more controlled. And yeah, so we are kind of more or less dependent on that, and we are limited in the fact that we now play on these chamber organs, which have become a stable part of mainstream early music, which is absolutely unauthentic, because Bach would have used the church organ, the large instrument in his church for accompanying. And in our cycle with the Vienna Academy in the Golden Hall and Musikverein, we often use the large organ, which has the ability to transpose a half tone lower. You press a button and the whole concert organ just drops down to 415 hertz. And there you have the feeling as an organist, you are much more a central part of the music making. You have more colors and you have simply more sound to control the accompaniment. Let's put it that way.
Very, very interesting. Well, so really understanding the actual, instruments performing on, because obviously Musica Angelica has a history of period historic instruments and kind of authentic performance. So to the best extent possible. And I think that obviously really distinguishes our music. So sounds like you threw the ball into Aaron's court there, that the evangelist has got to really drive.
Sorry about that.
The most
pressure, Aaron.
The most important, exactly.
So Aaron, I'm going to swing over to you, and as the evangelist, which is a role for tenor voice that you will be performing, is the principal storyteller, moving the drama along to what is described as a kind of half-sung, half-spoken recitative. So I would love to hear from you, because we were talking about interpretation of this music. As a performer, how much leeway do you feel you have in putting your own stamp on your performance in this role?
That's a great question. So there are some things that I see as that are necessary. I need to have the German correct. I need to have the rhythm correct, and I need to sing the notes correct. Those things are a given. And then what's left up to the individual is their own interpretation. And I've seen people, or I've been told before, that I should seem like I'm giving a lesson at the church for the Sunday. So that's a very just straightforward reading of it. But because it's also, we've been talking about it being so much like theater, I see it in a more of a dramatic way. And I think it really does come down to each person. I can read a text one way and you could read it another way. I think that Bach provides a lot in his composition. When it's supposed to be thrust forward, or when it should be laid back, and he gives you moments of arioso where you're just singing more, and he gives you moments of very spoken text to push it forward. I don't want to go away thinking I'm Aaron Sheehan, the great evangelist. I want you to come away from this hearing the story of St. Matthew. So I like to be more into the text, I guess, and just deliver what I see in front of me and what Bach wanted me, more than it's my interpretation, even though it is my interpretation.
Well, I certainly understand, the necessity to be true to the text. I think that's, something obviously that any performer, certainly in a theatrical context, learns to do, and not put themselves first, but put the interpretation of the character. So I think what you were describing is that there is kind of a prescribed path to follow, but that you do have some creative flexibility in the interpretation and portions of that.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like that. So I'm going to move on to another question here. I thought it was interesting in kind of doing the research. At the time of the original performance of St. Matthew Passion, only men sang in church, and the higher pitched vocal parts were performed by treble choristers. So how does the addition of the female soprano voice contribute to the interpretation of this piece of sacred music from your perspective?
At first, we have to imagine this church situation. Bach is not only the cantor of this church, he is also quasi a school teacher who has 3 voice choirs, regime. The good boys, the lesser good boys, and the boys who just can sing somewhere on a cemetery and so on. And he had to use these boys. We are not totally sure that he did not use some women in there. We know that he did early when he was younger in some of his church jobs. And we have to imagine this church situation. People go to church, they sit down, they hear this incredibly long piece. And in between this long piece, there was a sermon. So these people had to sit in church for, I would say, for almost 4 hours. So it was a dramaturgical, huge event to go to church in there. And in some ways, these people were in some ways ignorant. We have very few, there's not any review of the first performance. We just have a script of the janitor, maybe of the employee of the church who wrote down, today, a passion with 2 choirs. This is all what we have as a signal what happens in this church. Yeah. So in some ways, this is boys' choir music. Yeah, boys and men. On the other side, at first, I'm not totally sure that it was only boys and men. It could have been that a few women were already present, hidden on the balcony or somewhere, singing with the other groups. And soon after, it became a general piece for mixed choirs. I have done it with the boys' choir, and we have done another big piece, even with Musica Angelica, with one of the big boys' choirs in the past, with the Tölzer boys from Germany who came to Los Angeles to sing the B minor mass. But I think today what we get in sound today is very close to the sound which we have. Because the more important thing is that you don't have a choir here with 80 people, 90 people. It's not so massive. You have a small group, and that the soloists are kind of doing the choir part as well, and vice versa. Everybody who is on this stage in some ways is a soloist of the instruments. And just to add something to the instruments, you're going to hear and to see a number of instruments which you never have seen before in a normal symphony orchestra. So, for instance, the oboe players come with 3 different types of instruments. They come with the normal oboe, with the oboe d'amore, the love oboe, and with the oboe da caccia, the hunting oboe, which looks like a French horn. And the flute players, they're recorders, they're flutes. There's a viola da gamba participating. So there are a lot of different instruments to be enjoyed and to be used in the orchestra.
Very interesting. I want to swing back to Aaron, kind of staying in that vocal theme for a while. And it seems that the vocal components of St. Matthew Passion evolved, as we are discovering, in a revised version of the Passion that was written between 1743 and 1746, and is essentially the version that we will be presenting. This revised version included soprano, alto, tenor, and bass in both choirs. How do you think the addition of this full range of vocalists has improved the presentation of St. Matthew Passion?
When you sent the question before, it was news to me. I didn't know that he had rewritten this for soprano, alto. So maybe he was ahead of his time for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
By including the other half of humanity in his Passion. So, but I mean, I would love to hear Martin's version with the boys choir, but there's a very specific sound usually with boys when they sing. And so you're getting a wider range, I think, of vocal colors, vocal timbres. And just by including women, you're getting people in the story, like the 2 ancillas are women. And I reference Mary Magdalene and Mary in the Passion as well. So it helps to tell the story and to make it, I think, a little bit more human by including everyone.
Excellent.
But I think just to add this idea, the first version was also for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. This is just, it was just different. He used different movements and different, the size of the group was the same, and the combination. just my idea was that in the end of the life, it's like you have a strict regime. I'm quite, I cannot prove it because the music, there are sheets of music paper, and you're totally right, Aaron, with the ancilla and with the extra, with the bad man in the recitatives. I'm almost sure that there were some women in the performance in there already at Bach's times, which makes it more human in some ways. Yeah?
But it's very strange now that actually now's the time where using a boys' choir for Bach is exotic.
Sure.
Yeah. And I remember the performances with the Tulsa Boys Choir that we did in Austria and then also in Germany. And there is something very special about a youngster singing this most complex music, an aria, and to have this innocence with this complexity together. It's something different. And
Jeremy and I work with the Vienna Boys, which are not used to sing Bach, but which sing all the masses by Mozart, Haydn, and so on. And I came back actually 2 hours ago. I had a rehearsal with them to do Pergolesi Stabat Mater and the Coronation Mass by Mozart. And we came back from Norway with the Vienna Boys. And for sure, it's the same with the big masses by Haydn and Mozart. For sure, a mixed choir can do it very well. But these boys, we're doing it every Sunday, and Jeremy plays with them right now. I did for many years. This is special, and this is a special thing. But on the other side, Bach, especially the older Bach, is so incredibly rich and abstract with this music that this music sounds well if you do it with boys, if you do it with female voices, with male voices. And Jeremy mentioned the organ before. First Congregational has one of the huge pipe organs in this country, which is far too big and too powerful to be used with the orchestra. You would not hear the orchestra anymore. But we have added a fantastic recital with Jeremy doing romantic style Bach pieces. So Bach through the eyes of the big romantics, ending with Stokowski style Virgil Fox, who was the Liberace of the organ, and to have a very colorful idea how to do Bach. And so it's Bach. You can play Bach on marimba phones and on percussion, and it will sound well. Or And so I think these two versions, to have this big romantic organ sounds the day before, and then to have the pure sound of period instruments the next day, is another interesting addition to how to understand and how to listen to Bach.
Yeah, and on my organ program, there is a transcription by Charles-Marie Widor, the famous French 19th century composer, a transcription of the final chorus of the St. Matthew's Passion.
For organ solo, yeah?
Exactly. So in a much slower tempo indication, very thick voicings and so on. But I think it's a nice bridge to our cleaner performance on Sunday.
So it sounds like, Jeremy, you're going to get to play on that big organ in the church.
Yeah, it's great. Sure. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, that will be fun. Now, Martin mentioned Liberace. So does that mean you're going to be breaking out the gold lame?
Yeah, I've had my shiny organ shoes and the smoke machine.
There we go.
With diamonds.
Excellent. So one of the things I kind of want to sort of get into now is a little bit of, we're going to dive into the religion a little bit. We're going to start with the church. One thing that I've experienced in my time with Musica Angelica is the absolute incredible difference between hearing this music at a sort of performance venue that's designed maybe for theater or other activities, and then in a church. I mean, it's just absolutely riveting, the difference of the sound. And in Bach's case, he was the music director for the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig from 1723 to 1750. So the early associations, it seems, between Baroque music and churches suggest that this music, whether it's sacred or secular, was most often presented in church. And I'm wondering, it's for all of you to answer this, so dive in where you would like, but do you feel that the church setting is ultimately the best venue for this type of music, or do you feel that both the sacred and secular music can be presented in any appropriate setting?
Who wants to start? Aaron?
I have I don't know if I have a definitive answer on that. I always do prefer sacred music in a church.
Yeah.
It always feels more right. I've done Passions in a concert hall, and they're beautiful and wonderful, but the part that's missing is the church. It adds an ambiance. It adds a different acoustic as well, usually. So I'm someone that usually prefers my sacred music in a church. It's kind of, if you think of an opera being done in a church, it lots of times doesn't work it the other way. So I would argue for it being, I love singing it in the Congregational Church in LA. Like, that's a perfect space for it.
Yeah, usually there are two sides to it. The acoustic usually, especially in America, in most churches is better than in many of the smaller theaters, because the theaters have carpet and everything is very dry and for speaking acoustics. And for sure, the big concert halls have beautiful acoustic. But on the other side, there's maybe a difference between Catholic church music and Bach, because the Catholics made a strict difference already in the Baroque between church and opera music, between pieces like Handel operas or church music, which were done in the sacred rooms and so on. For Bach, if he writes concertos and so on, his music is very similar between church music and concerto music. There's not so much difference, because Bach has his Bach style. And in some ways we can say he preaches to us, he tells us stories in any of his music. And therefore the Passions work in concert halls, but First Congregational is a very special place for me. This is a traditional place, and it has the atmosphere. You come in, it has a dignified atmosphere, and it has a beautiful acoustic for this music. So I would say this is an ideal place to perform Bach.
Yeah, I've had different experiences. During my student years in Germany, I played in the local churches, the Matthew's Passion, and it was extremely pious and from, as they say in German, where people didn't clap afterwards.
No.
The conductor just sat down in silence and yeah. So, and I think you also get sometimes really two different audiences. One, the church audience, the congregation goer, and then the music lover, as Martin earlier mentioned. Yeah, but I think it really doesn't matter where you're playing. I think this music is just simply strong enough to bring the message forth.
Well, it seems definitely that, you know, the church setting is kind of as I remember from my theater days, is the original proscenium. And, you know, the altar was kind of the stage where you'd have entrances and exits. People would have lines, they would have different costumes, you know, and so it's kind of interesting to reflect on that. Well, we know that, you know, St. Matthew Passion and the gospel that it is drawn from kind of appears to suggest that its roots are in a number of Christian religious influences, certainly Lutheran, which was Bach, Catholic, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Presbyterian. So a question I have is, do these religious influences deter or enhance the universal appeal of this music to a wider audience? Or is there such a strong universal theme of pain, suffering, love, and resurrection that give this work a greater appeal?
I don't want to be the first one to answer it, but if I do, I would say there are several levels. At first, the sheer quality of the music, as I put it, is so strong, and the message which you get from the intensity of music, that you can listen to it even being agnostic, or it's just great music. And then the other thing is, in contrast to the St. John's Passion, the other one, which had caused always lots of discussions with Jewish communities and so on, because there's some wording in there which could be considered to be almost anti-Semitic, because the St. John's Gospel was something which was very, from the Greek background, very almost anti-Judaistic. Yeah, but in the St. Matthew Passion, it's always you have the story from the Bible, and then you have the meditations in the arias, and then you have the strong, like in the theater, these strong crowd descriptions, yeah, from the choruses. So I would say, you could say, yeah, I cannot speak for all the audiences. You could see it as a great piece of music, and as a piece which is so peaceful, so powerful that it changes your mind if you're sitting in there, I would say. And then again, you can see it as a piece of great church music. And as Jeremy said in the beginning, it's not liturgical music, or it's not music which is a servant of any kind of religion or liturgy. It's beyond, yeah. And you can see it like a big theatrical piece. And I think this message is stronger than the kind of domination message to whether it's a Catholic or a Lutheran or whatever piece. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a real universal appeal because of the emotional text of the music. Well, when you listen to it, my goodness, it touches your very soul. There's no question about it. I'm going to stay with religion. Sorry, folks, I'm on the religion path here. But just I got very interested in reading about Bach. Throughout his lifetime, Bach was a devout Lutheran and is often referred to as the fifth evangelist alongside Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. He once wrote, "The aim and final end of all music should be none other than the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul." So the question for all of you, and then we'll lay down the religious sword for a while, is as musicians and creative artists, does faith and or spirituality influence your work?
Well, I grew up Lutheran as well. So I mean, I feel like I have an upbringing. I don't know if I'm really that religious anymore. I'm spiritual. And so yeah, I see that as my upbringing as a basis for understanding this music and understanding the story. And also to go back on the last question, I do a lot of opera that you're in another world where you're dealing with gods like Zeus and Apollo, and you're dealing with all these gods. I think you can, if you're not a religious person, you can come and see the St. Matthew Passion and view it as a story of history that is very equal to some of these other operas that we hear. So, and I had an opera director once say that you need two books if you're going to do Baroque music. One is the Bible and one is the Ovid's Metamorphoses, and that you'll have all the stories you need for Baroque music. I think that I think there's some passion in being a believer in doing this music, and I think it's very special for those people that are very religious and getting to do a passion like this. That's a very important thing. But I think it's also, you don't have to have that to be able to be moved by this piece and to feel the humanity in it.
Yeah, I also grew up in an Anglican home, and of course, I'm not particularly religious, but being an organist, you are always connected to the church. Somewhere or the other, you can't escape it. It's just a daily routine, being in church, practicing, and so on. But I also don't necessarily think that you have to be Christian or religious to perform this music. There's some great Bach recordings of a group from Japan, this Bach Collegium Japan, which has a completely different culture and religion, and they do a wonderful job with this music. The music speaks for itself, and I think good musicians will bring the best out of this music.
Yeah, we know from Bach himself that he was a devout Lutheran, but a very strict Lutheran who left one of his jobs because the church pastor there was teaching in a different tradition, in the Pietism tradition, which he did not support. So we know exactly that he was very religious, and he's preaching his music. This is a fact. Yeah. Otherwise, we don't know of whether Michelangelo was religious or not, creating, or whether the creators of the Sixtine Chapel and so on. I would support this. You don't have to be religious to do sacred music. Yeah. But on the other side, you are surrounded by these products which were written for the liturgy, for the church, which were written to tell us something religious. So in some ways, we feel, we post-Enlightenment people, we feel that the art becomes our religion already. This was the feeling of the 19th century, the Kunstreligion type. The art is able to support. And I was just reading a nice word by the poet Schiller, who wrote to a musician that it's not fashionable anymore to be religious, but maybe the art can help religion to become more fashionable again. Yeah, and in some ways this might be true. If you're in a church building and you see these incredible paintings, you see the architecture of a Gothic cathedral, you hear Bach, you hear some of this great music. It's a unity, and it tells us something to it. It changes you, whether you want or not, probably. Yeah.
Well, absolutely.
I think that the idea also of the fifth evangelist, for me, it has more to do with than just being Bach, Bach being the spreader of the gospel, but more to do with him being a really great storyteller.
Yeah, sure.
So we'll weave out of the religion and we'll dive back into the theater for a bit, because I think there are elements of the Passion that display this. In the late 1600s, the theater was considered dangerous, something to be avoided at all costs, lest one wander into sin and wantonness. These are words, not my words, but words that I plucked from the internet. St. Matthew Passion is a triumphant affirmation of the power of theater to depict profound spiritual drama. So the question for all is, how important to the overall performance are the theatrical aspects of St. Matthew Passion? And how will they be presented in this version of the Passion?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to the question you asked, like how much leeway I had in the dramatic presentation of my recitative. Because that will, the way that, I mean, I'm acting as the storyteller, and then you have the choir coming in and they're acting as the crowd and the turba. Then you have another person playing Jesus and another someone playing Peter, and then you have a soloist come up at a moment to have a moment of contemplation. So you have all of these aspects of theater that maybe you're not in a theater and it's on the concert stage, but I think that's the main thing for me that would be driving anything theatrical in this piece.
Very good. I want to, so the sort of big question of the day for me is, and I think one as performers you can all appreciate, and I think we're always mindful in any kind of presentation or performance of what's the impact on the audience. So I want to ask a question, which is, obviously in the Passion, there are many very solemn moments. And it appears that Bach, as an intense religious and creative man, was suggesting the great importance of a very interpersonal and soulful relationship between God and man. Bach ends the Passion with the darkly textured chorus in tears of grief, leaving his parishioners in a sorrowful mood, knowing that they would be celebrating Christ's resurrection in a few days. So in your opinion, what is the one important message that audience members should take away from St. Matthew Passion? And I realize this is a big, drum roll question, but I'd love to hear what you think, the audience should be taking away as they leave the church on Sunday, April 2nd, after this glorious performance.
If I talk about myself, I have done the St. Matthew Passion probably 40 times, playing it, conducting it. And every time I go out of the place where we did it, and I said, oh, this is like the first time. I'm really, it moves me too, because and probably it's I can speak for my colleagues. If I have an evangelist who just has thrown himself in, and it's you leave the place, it's a changed person. This would be the impact I want to wish for the audience. But I don't want to improve anybody. We don't want to be moralists, but I want to be able to create, with the help of this music, an atmosphere which can change you, which can move you, which can make you think. In some ways, which can get you out of a routine, I would say. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Any other thoughts there, Jeremy?
Yeah, well, as a player, it's really a journey for the organist, because we play more or less non-stop for 2.5 hours. So at the end of the Passion, I'm always completely drained, but so thankful that I've had the chance to play this piece once again, and really look forward to the next time that I'm going to play it. And yeah, as an organist, it's really become a part of my repertoire, something I really look forward to doing, and torturing myself for 2.5 hours of concentration, of difficult chords and harmonies to catch in the worst tonalities.
Yeah, well, it seems like you have to keep that kind of technical part of yourself as a musician and artist and performer kind of intact, so that you are, you want to be emotionally stirred and emotionally moved also, because you would convey that to the audience, no doubt. Same thing I would think for Aaron and his role as the evangelist, is that technically you've got to follow a path, but emotionally you want to be connected to it so that your audience is connected to it. Seems like that. Does that seem right, Aaron? Or I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, it's very much, I mean, this is the St. Matthew evangelist for me is much harder than the St. John, because it's much longer, and it overall sits a whole step higher, I feel like, than the St. John. You have a lot more high A's, you have a written high B, you have some B flats. And so technically, as a tenor, you really have to be thinking in order to create those notes consistently. But you also then want to tell a story. So that's why I've been practicing at home this week.
That's great. That's wonderful. So Martin had mentioned this earlier, and this may be the last question for us. We're coming to the end of our time. Mentioned Felix Mendelssohn mounted the first modern performance of St. Matthew Passion, and it was a rousing success, which led to a revival of all Bach's music. And it's almost unbelievable to imagine that in the late 1820s, Bach had fallen into virtual obscurity since his death 80 years earlier. And I know you all are familiar with the man, so I'm just wondering, considering his stature as a composer of such extraordinary genius and widespread influence, how could someone like Johann Sebastian Bach fall into obscurity? How did that happen?
This is easy to explain. He just got out of Passion. It's like a pop star who is not heard anymore. And then he was too complicated for a new audience which loved simplicity. He wrote his complex, his wild pieces, and then even during his lifetime, he was attacked for being too complex, too difficult. And the next generation just wanted to have cheaper and simpler and easier music. And then the problem was the music was not printed, it was just handwritten. And a lot of his big pieces got lost. Yeah, and this was just a chance that at the time Leipzig became more provincial. In Vienna, people were more interested to get to hear about it. Mozart came to Leipzig and saw some of the Bach manuscripts, and he said, "This is genius," and so on. But he was the only one. And Mendelssohn was very young. He was, I think, 20. Yeah, when he did this performance, and then he wanted to promote this music, but you didn't have any choirs anymore who were able to sing it. It was just too complicated to perform. You didn't have the instruments anymore. And so it took a long time until the Renaissance really started, and which is very different from, let's say, from Handel, who who was the much better businessman, who was the much better guy in the public. And so, but on the other side, the discovery of Bach was a rediscovery, was a miracle for a whole century, because there was more and more music found, and every piece was a treasure. Yeah.
Yeah, when you're talking about his music being too complex, there was also, after the first performance of the Matthew's Passion, a critic in the newspaper by Johann Adolf Scheiber, criticizing that the piece is far too complex to understand and so on. And it's very funny in Bach in his later years, when people referred to the composer Bach, they were talking about Philipp Emanuel, Carl Philipp Emanuel, his son. Yeah, it was popular, was much simpler in sound. But I think even though he disappeared for that period of time, I'm sure his influence was still extremely strong.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole subject of how people approach this music often seems to be sort of steeped in, well, it's an intellectual experience. And I like to say to our audiences, or those that are new to this, well, that's a little too highbrow for me, or too intellectual, and kind of like to try to get them to a place where this is about emotion, it's about feeling. So it's interesting, because obviously there was complexity in his compositions, but and he was a musical genius. So it's just interesting that subject of intellectualism versus emotionalism in the music. So because we do have time for just one kind of final comment, I'd love to hear from all of you. Obviously, the art form that we're in, which is the period instrument orchestra, that we're hearing the sound that the composer intended for the audience to hear. How do you believe that this art form can be perpetuated and sustained? And of course, how do you attract, new players to that? I mean, I think that's always the subject of, we want obviously new musicians who are trained in the period instrument playing. But I'd love to hear your quick thoughts on that.
I think there are more and there are better players than ever for this kind of instruments. Yeah. So I would say I have my last years at a university teacher. I was teaching since more than 40 years, and the standard has gone up tremendously. And we see about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I started my own orchestra, we didn't have any local oboe players for period instruments. We had to get the trumpet players from England. Then it started very soon. And then right now, the latest trend is that it's not an either or. It's not you play modern violin or period instrument. The young guys can do both. So it's fascinating for me, the interest of these young players. And I think it's this search for the true thing, because right now we have period instruments for Bach. Later on, there came the period instruments for the classical music for Mozart. And right now we think, okay, how was the romantic? Which instrument did Richard Wagner use for his big operas? Yeah. So a big movement and fascinating movement, and a lot of input from the youngest generation of performers.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I think Baroque music, in terms of period instrument groups, is now pretty mainstream, and you have many music faculties around Europe, and I guess probably also the States, where they have an early music department, and students learning modern instruments can also take up historical instruments as a second subject, or whatever it may be. But I think the moving into romantic music is really very interesting, and that it's kind of left. Well, it's still a lot of Baroque music played, but it's really moving to Stravinsky and so on. The recordings of the Rite of Spring, and Martin recorded Liszt and Bruckner, and also the effect that it's had on modern orchestras, because I think modern orchestras also approach Baroque music in a different way now, or classical Viennese classical music. So it's changed a lot of things, and hopefully the future is still bright.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, we're beginning to see some of that emergence here locally. But Aaron, I want to let you have a word in here.
Well, I just agree with Martin too. I mean, I've been singing now for 20 years, and I used to be based in Boston, and like that was the capital of early music in the United States. And I used to go to other places in the country, and maybe the level wasn't as good, but now I can go anywhere in the country, and I usually have an amazing Baroque orchestra playing with me. So I agree, there's more people doing it, and if you go to school now, it's kind of a given that you are handed a Baroque bow and a Baroque cello to at least try it out, so that you have the option of educating yourself. So I think things are looking up.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on today. I want to thank you all again for your time and for all of your wonderful comments and your expertise. Really excited, more excited now than I was even before, for looking forward to this one. It's on April 2nd. And just so you all know, this conversation is being recorded today, and it will be rebroadcast, placed on our website, so you'll be able to watch it again. But thank you so much for your time and for your talents and contributions. Certainly your involvement in Musica Angelica. We're most appreciative. And Martin, look forward to seeing you very soon. And everybody have a wonderful afternoon and evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you very soon. Take good care. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.